Billy's Experiment, written by Jonathan Dunne, read for you by the author. To Dorothy, who loved a good whodunit. To forget how to dig the earth and tend the soil is to forget ourselves. Mahatma Gandhi. Prologue. Night Nurse. The night nurse, that angel of death, was yet to come to room 1402, the same room where Bill and Dorothy Steward sat vigil at their child's bedside. "Where is your God now, Dor? Bill Steward was furious with Mother Nature and her whimsical, devil-may-care attitude, giving birth to babies and killing those infants with the same wave of her bittersweet magic wand. Talk about a tough break. Where is any God when you want one? They keep saying he's a terminal patient. Don't they realize how horribly cold that sounds? Terminal? Nothing's terminal. Terminal only happens when we think we know where the end is." Even Bill didn't understand his own words, but deep down somewhere he knew it made sense. He said in defiance, "They just accept his terminal because they can't cure him. We're all just passing through." Dorothy answered in distant, monotone cadence. "Some of us faster than others. Once we shed the trappings of our physical bodies, our souls become—" "Bullshit!" Bill snapped, immediately regretting it. "I'm not talking about souls and reincarnation, Dor. Stop trying to twist this. You know where I stand, where I've always stood." "Bill, God works in mysterious Please, let's just leave it there." Dorothy averted Bill's eyes. Instead, she kept her gaze on the tips of her shoes. Bill observed how his wife rubbed at a spot on the tip of her right loafer, as if she couldn't accept it was a scuff mark, and not something stuck to her shoe. She rubbed and rubbed until it looked a lot like a metaphor for her denial of this nightmare situation they have found themselves in. Unable to remain sitting, Bill got up and peered out the window. A heavy mist was falling, and twilight had succumbed to night. Day and night were mixed into one over the last couple of weeks. These forever fluorescent hallways didn't have a night and day. Unless one of them glanced out the ward window, they wouldn't realize there was a world outside these hospital walls. Down below, Bill viewed ambulances come and go. Life carried on. He searched deep within himself to understand his wife's chilling detachment. He knew this was her way of coping with their son's terminal cancer, trying to understand something that wasn't understandable, searching for a reason their 3-year-old son was knocking on death's door tonight. They shared this tacit understanding. Bill got why his wife preferred to study her footwear rather than bring herself to look at her emaciated living dead son lying in the bed. Bill opined, "This isn't supposed to happen. I'm supposed to go first and my son after me. That's the natural law. I'd gladly swap places." "Oh, now you're being silly." Dorothy wasn't having any of it. But Bill Steward's words would come back to haunt him in the future. The worm of panic wriggled in Bill's insides, and he did everything in his power to stay sitting in his warped plastic seat in that oncology department, in a concrete construction with kids dying around him, and nobody seemed panicked. It was Mother Nature's genocide, natural selection, and humanity sat back and enjoyed the horror show from ringside seats. Bill couldn't figure out how society could distance itself simply because a patient was terminal. Something on a primordial level had gone wrong somewhere along the line. His son was lying in the oncology pediatric department, painted with Disney characters whose smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. Mickey Mouse, Donald, Goofy, and even Ariel were all in on this cover-up. Instead of demanding his wife to produce God from the magic top hat he always seemed to hide in, he took his wife's hand in his. "You go home. I'll take tonight's watch." Dorothy considered her husband. "But you did last night." "Go," he told her with a smile. "You look rough." "Oh, thank you for the compliment." She hadn't lost her caustic sense of humour, and that was a godsend in these dark times. "You're welcome." He kissed his wife on the cheek. I'll call you with any news." They both knew what that announcement would be. They had been on tenterhooks, waiting for that statement for the past fortnight, for now no news is such sweet good news. Dorothy got up and kissed her son on the cheek. Bill was aware it could be the last time she would kiss their child. Somewhere along the way they had become numb to all of this. That was the only consolation they had. His wife had remained in the denial phase. She could not accept, which is why she kept up this cold, tough exterior of defiance. Bill watched his wife recede down the hallway. Jesus, she was only a bag of bones, unable to find her appetite these days. He knew a moment would come when Dorothy would re-find herself and scream. He would be there for her when it came. Bill moved back inside room 1402 and took the hip flask of neat Jameson whiskey from the pocket of his jacket hanging on the back of the plastic chair. Bill took a healthy swig to take the edge off. It was purely medicinal, and he knew where his boundaries lay. "What have I done to deserve this?" he asked himself, but scolding himself just as fast for being so fucking greedy guts. What had his boy done to deserve this? That was the real question here. Bring on your gods. For the first time in his life, Bill Steward talked, not prayed, to Jesus. He figured a little chat, man to man, couldn't hurt. Maybe even beg JC for intervention, divine or otherwise. He gazed at his ill son, a tiny figure in the bed, nothing more than an emaciated, jaundiced, balding, walking, talking skeleton. The mummified child Pharaoh he'd seen in the Valley of the Kings as part of their Nile honeymoon didn't look all that different. That tour turned out to be real gimmicky. As the whiskey hit and numbed all the right nerve endings in his system, a smile kindled on Bill's face as he recalled that beautiful cloudless morning when Dorothy and himself took a balloon ride over the Nile. It had been a sort of romantic encounter until Bill felt that first gut bubble. He had eaten something that didn't agree with him, and he felt the onset of severe diarrhea in a basket with 15 other tourists, 2,000 feet over the sparkling Nile River. He had a nightmarish vision of cocking his bare ass over the rim of the basket to relieve himself into the Nile River below. Talk about making your mark. Ah, happy days. His son's silly hospital gown, far too baggy for him, had slipped down around his shoulders, revealing the heart-shaped birthmark on the lower right side of his neck. The more Bill looked at his son, the more anxiety he felt. Heart palpitations knocked inside his chest for the first time in his life. Afraid for himself, he walked down the hallway to the nurse's station to ask for some kind of sedative, anything to help him calm down and relieve the tension. The nurses outright refused. Bill Steward was walking back to his son's room when a nurse strode ahead of him and made a point of leaving a small paper cup of water and a little white pill on one windowsill. She flashed him a surreptitious glance. He thanked her before she skipped away on her rounds. Bill took himself to his child's bedside and downed the tablet, not with the paper cup of water, but with a heavy triple slug of whiskey. Mixing alcohol and medication was a big no-no, but he was desperate. He stuck his ear pods in his ears and listened to the haunting triplet sequence of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata on an eternal loop, kind of like how he felt. He liked to switch on this piano lullaby to ease himself into sleep on nights when the land of Nod was just too far away. Tonight, he was especially desperate for that sweet, numbing cloak. Bill's erratic sleeping pattern only began 6 months ago when they first found out about their 3-year-old's illness. Bill found that focusing on one corner of his bedroom ceiling helped to induce him into some kind of pre-sleep state. He did the same now, focusing on a small patch above him in the ceiling's corner. The spot was so far back he had to rest his head on the back of his chair. Soon, Bill was wallowing in one of the deepest narcotic sleeps of his life, and he didn't care if he never woke up. That was when she appeared. The night nurse slipped into the stuffy room 1402. Bill, under the influence of the sedative washed down with whiskey, was numb. So insensate he'd only been vaguely aware of that surreal creeping visitor. In his dreamlike state he perceived a slithering and dragging from somewhere about him, blending in with Beethoven's piano. In his befuddled mind he thought he was listening to the sweep of the cleaner's mop. A dark silhouette was standing at the foot of his son's bed now. The room was dim, and Bill was seeing everything through the haze of the something to take the edge off sedative. One of the night nurses was doing her rounds, but in his feverish delirium the figure appeared to stretch up to the ceiling. He forced his eyelids open a little more to drag himself from this lucid dream. It was a nurse, with her back to him, but her uniform looked wrong, old-fashioned. Nurses don't wear a nurse's cap anymore, or do they? This nurse dressed like a time traveller, trying to fit in but out of touch. Now Bill could see her side profile as she stood over the boy. She was wearing a face mask. The area of her face above the mask remained in the shadows. And all the while, Moonlight Sonata played softly in Bill's ears. It seemed a fitting tune in this sedative-induced, dreamy dream. The night nurse grew 2-3 meters tall. Bill, through a dribbling fuzzy mist, saw the nurse's head and cap touch the ceiling. In complete silence, she turned to Bill and signalled him to be quiet, holding her index finger to her face mask. There was something off about the colour of her skin, exceedingly pale and blemished, as if she had suffered from severe acne as a teenager. Bill could make out her pitted skin in the light as the happy fuzzy feeling filled him. Through his altered state of consciousness, Bill assumed the nurse was telling him to be quiet because the child was sleeping. He didn't question the night nurse's abnormally long index finger held to her face mask. A dizzy cocktail of sleep deprivation and the pollutants in his system kept Bill groggy, and he was more than happy to go along on this surreal ride. The night nurse studied the child, looking him over like he was a specimen in a cage in a backstreet black market. With her back to Bill, she did something with the boy. From his plastic chair, Bill watched her from behind, regarded her spindly elbows and arms move mechanically over the 3-year-old, as if fashioning yarn from wool. What was she doing to the boy in this feverish nightmare? He was sure he caught the glint of glass in her hands. Her hands, yes, spindly and pockmarked, and possessed that morbid ivory only the dead take on. "What are you doing?" No matter how hard he tried, Bill couldn't make that transition from inside his head to outside it. He wasn't sure if he had spoken those words or they still remained inside his head. Bill gagged when he saw the night nurse spit into a glass jar of darkish liquid held in her deformed grey hands. What kind of medical practice was this? She turned towards Bill. From behind her face mask, she croaked in a raspy whisper, "The child has left." In his groggy stupor, Bill witnessed the nurse lower her face mask and plant a tender kiss on the boy's forehead, then fix her mask once again. She then crossed to Bill, lowered her face protection, bent down and kissed his cheek with glacial lips. He caught the ghost of an odour. Earthy mouldiness came from the night nurse's breath as she leaned over him. Bill would recall that musty aroma later, pulling it from the filing system of memories. Through the layers of happy drowsy time, the cold meatiness of the nurse's lips pricked his conscience and his skin. Her harmless peck on the cheek graduated into a painful sucking love bite. He was sure she had spoken a couple of soft words drowned out by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata lullaby, but they had morphed into the tinkle of piano keys by the time they were in Bill's head. As she drew away from Bill, he glimpsed her face before she replaced the mask, and what he saw would stay with him indefinitely. The cadaverous face of the night nurse wasn't a nurse at all, but a mouldering angel of death, spun from the stuff of nightmares. Bill drowned in the ruminative, convulsive workings of her face. He was floating now. His eyelids became heavy, and he floundered in the surging wave of sleep that washed over him. As he whirled on the sedative alcohol merry-go-round, he heard that same slithering shuffle rise behind him. By the time it had dawned on Bill Steward to turn around, dawn had arrived. It was Friday, Halloween, October 31st, 2014. Damp. 1. All shook up. Bill Steward was on his way back to the office. He had already driven by 2 or 3 individuals lurking in the undergrowth, had made eye contact with them even without knowing it. On the radio, Elvis was singing All Shook Up. Bill was singing along with the king in his Mitsubishi 4x4 he nicknamed Mitzi. Bill admired the twilight view as he bounced along the forest trail on that Saturday afternoon, October 31st, 2015. Halloween had come around again. From up here on the crest of Black Valley, he could see everything stretch out before him in inky blue. The predicted blood moon hung low over the trees in the eastern sky, suspended between the towering peak silhouettes of Magritte Mountain. Tonight was the night of the ultra-rare blood moon eclipse. Several TV and radio networks had advertised it. Being an amateur astronomer, Bill had been counting down the nights to tonight. He had his fancy-pants binoculars resting on the passenger seat next to him. A nightly mist had crept up out of the valley from the lake below. Soon it would shroud the mountainside in its ethereal white cloak. Just as well Bill Steward knew Oldcastle National Park like the back of his hand. Once or twice a year, the mist left the uninitiated lost and afraid. Whatever about lost tourists, Bill was hoping the mist wouldn't obscure his view of the eclipse tonight. "Bill, you there, darling?" The voice filled the 4x4, startling Bill, who had been away in his own little world. He picked up the CB receiver from his cradle on the dash and executed his finest Elvis impression. "Uh-huh. Over." "Oh," the woman answered. "Elvis, sorry to bother you. This is Lucy Devereaux. Could you put me on to Bill Steward, please? I need to speak to him about some delinquents." Bill thanked Elvis for the message, adding, "Yes, Lucy, over." From the ramshackle prefab office, 13 kilometres from where Bill was at that moment, Lucy Devereaux informed the ranger, "More people have called in about that band of Halloween hooligans hanging around the entrance to the park, done up in spooky costumes and playing chicken with oncoming traffic. They've caused a bottleneck back along the new line as far as town. Locals still call the stretch of road between the National Park and Oldcastle the new line, even though the road had existed since the 50s. "Lucy, it's Halloween. Cut people a little slack. What disturbance are we talking about? Over." "Loitering?" So the evidence is building. Halloween costumes and loitering. Over. There's already been a couple of near misses tonight, Bill. They've spotted the creeps near the park and... Oh, wait, you're being sarcastic. Sarcasm is the lowest form of wit. Didn't your mommy ever tell you that? Look, there's only one creep in this park right now, and you're talking to him. Over, joked Bill. The road is Big Tom's jurisdiction. I'm the park ranger, and what goes on inside the gates of this place is my jurisdiction. And until that happens, I'm not getting involved. Over. Do you take anything seriously? Bill paused. Lucy, after what Dorothy and I went through this very day last year, I take nothing seriously. It was the scariest Halloween of my life. Over. And for a second, Bill Steward melted inside. He willed back the tears. The park ranger was overcome with a terrible desire to weep. Even a year on, he was still standing on the precipice of grief, his toes peeping out over the edge of oblivion. Unlike his wife Dorothy, Bill had learned to assimilate and accommodate the grief because it would never go away, just hide, and it was bigger than he was. He had learned to control these urges and surges which came at the most inopportune of moments. A lull came on the transmission waves as Lucy Devereaux was trying to figure out what had happened a year ago. Bill had caught her off guard. Oh my God! 1 year, she reflected. Time flies. A year had passed since Bill's son died. Lucy added, I'm happy for you. Should I even say that? What I'm trying to say is that I admire your outlook on life. You are sanguine. Is that the word? Another person might sink. I'm staying afloat. Over. Bill could have delved deeper into that metaphor, but over the CB was not the moment. Lucy answered back with joy in her voice. And good for you, Bill Steward. Good for you. You know why, Lucy? Because horror has taught me how to appreciate every moment. Over. And Dorothy? Is she feeling any better these days? Bill couldn't lie to Lucy. Tough going. Sometimes I think she's getting over her depression and wants to leave the house, but it's usually a false alarm. She just doesn't have much interest in life, whereas I see life as a precious gift since we lost him. Strange how death affects the living. Over. An awkward silence bloomed on the radio waves. So what about those hooligans? Lucy inquired, falling back into her lovable old doggedness. Donny McCoy said he saw them loitering around the gates, down by the public car park. Too close for my liking, she added with an ominous air. Donny said they were all done up in creepy Halloween costumes. Don is kind of creepy, don't you think? Over. You know what I think, Bill Steward? I think you're being deliberately dumb because you want to go home for the night. Don't be silly, you know I'm not deliberately dumb. Lucy snorted laughter down the line. Mike Hannafin rang in. Of course he did. Mike has nothing else to do with his time besides waste hours. And what had he to say for himself? I quote, "Oh, you're not paraphrasing this time. Impressive." Over. I spotted a bunch of weirdos during my power walk along the new line this evening. Lucy cleared her throat and imitated Mike Hannafin's gruff cadence, howling, grunting, and getting up to all kinds of devilment. Wow, you do a good Mike Hannafin. Have you seen Mike in one of his power walks? He's got those ridiculous ski poles and a headband. It's the stuff of legend, Bill suggested. It'll be a bunch of morons letting off some steam. You know this new craze where men, or should I say males, head out into the wilds and be hunter-gatherers again, remembering what it was to be a caveman. Give me Netflix, a bowl of popcorn, a pedicure, and I'll feel man enough. Over. Lucy Devereux sniggered at this notion. Bill opined, "Perhaps people are staying at the guest lodges." Over. "I spoke to Cindy McNamara," started Lucy. The ranger interrupted. "Cindy and her cat minions." Over. "Oh, Bill, all those staring cats give me the heebie-jeebies. There's just something about cats. They're privy to something we're not. I'm convinced they're planning a sly rebellion, and someday we'll be back praying to the ancient goddess Bastet." "Oh, profound, Lucy, but who prays to a basket?" Over. "Anyway, I called Cindy out of curiosity, and she says nobody should be up there at the lodges tonight because the cold up there would freeze the balls off a brass monkey. I'm just the messenger. Would you mind taking one run up there to the cabins? Pretty please? Cindy's afraid of her life squatters might move in. It's on your way back to the office anyway." "Well, that's not true. It's a good bit out of my way, but you said pretty please." Over. He took a right where the trail branched off into two smaller tracks. "By the way, there's an eclipse tonight. A blood moon and Halloween night. It doesn't get much better than that. Will you watch it? It's about to happen. Thought I might get a bird's eye view from up around Magrique, but the mist is gathering." Over. Lucy answered, "Nope, no interest in the moon." "Lucy, try taking a peek out that window every now and again." Over. "If I hear one more word about that bloody moon eclipse..." Bill howled. "Blood moon." Over. "I prefer to read a book at night rather than gawp at the boring moon. It doesn't do anything." The park ranger didn't have any comeback for that. I wouldn't bother if he had. "I'm reading a creepy novel now called Hotel Miramar. It's about this vacant run-down hotel in a forgotten seaside town. Only the hotel isn't vacant, and the guests aren't guests." The park ranger had stopped listening to Lucy because it was at this point of his nocturnal route when he thought he clocked something from the corner of his eye. The individual was standing on the left-hand side of the trail, far enough into the undergrowth that Bill had only sensed it on a subliminal level. "I'm going to knock off for the evening," said Lucy. "Have a good weekend, what's left of it. Tell Dorothy I was asking for her." "It's bingo night, right? Over." The secretary chimed. "Two fat ladies, 88. "Oh, I wouldn't go that far," chided Bill. "Just a little thicker on the ankle. But if you're telling me 1988 is the year you were born, then I just might believe you." Over. "Bill Steward, you're hilarious," droned Lucy. "Patty and myself were just saying the other day that you're such a..." Bill Steward didn't hear the rest of Lucy's humorous dig as he slammed on the brakes, letting out a heartfelt, "Jesus Christ!" 2. The Scaretaker. Earlier that same Halloween Saturday, Old Man was filling in a fresh grave, or better said, Mike Devine was doing the filling in. It was about 2 hours before the park ranger Bill Steward engaged in his last conversation with Lucy Devereux. The cemetery caretaker and his grave digger apprentice had spent the earlier part of the day tending to the graves. Mike listened to Old Man engage in mumbling small talk with the dead as he shuffled around the 400-and-something-year-old cemetery, pulling weeds and tidying up haggard wreaths. As the cemetery caretaker doddered around the headstones, he collected any insects he found along the way. Woodlice, ladybirds and centipedes. Millipedes were the most common find, while he considered caterpillars and worms the major prize. His apprentice never asked what he wanted with these invertebrates, but Old Man could see how young Devine found it repulsive every time he dropped the wriggling mass of creepy crawlies into the front pockets of his weathered donkey jacket he never took off, no matter what the weather said. That repulsion he saw on his assistant's face brought the ghost of a smile to his cracked lips. He promised the gravedigger a day off if he could catch him a frog, which was a catch-22, because Mike would only end up having double the amount of work the following day. It had happened once or twice. Old Man wasn't interested in dry-skinned toads. The caretaker was only interested in amphibians that glisten. Maybe even a newt or two. Mike Devine had once asked him why toads didn't make the cut, but the caretaker just answered, "Toads don't work, son," and left it at that. He didn't want young Devine snooping around and seeing things he shouldn't see, especially in the basement. "I don't take my work lightly," groaned Old Man, leaning on his shovel as he watched his assistant backfill the fresh grave with considerable gusto. Mike murmured, "Lightly? You sure about that?" as he sweated over the grave, puffing and panting. "What's that, boy?" Despite his incredible age, Old Man knew the young gravedigger was aware of his apparent deafness and should, for his own sake and safety, use a hearing aid, maybe a couple of them. His apprentice once made the mistake of mentioning it, and Old Man barked back, "I hear what I hear, son." And that was the truth. "I was just saying I love my work," the apprentice answered. Great to see a gravedigger take such pride in his profession. But you should slow down, lad," the old caretaker advised. "You're filling in that grave as if young Fallon's going to make one last run for it. That young man isn't going anywhere fast. Poor devil, struck down in his prime." What was once Josh Fallon, now full of chemicals, face blush, and reconstructive wires, was lying at the bottom of the grave thanks to his 1500cc Kawasaki. 1cc too many for old Joshy. Josh Fallon came from the richest family in Oldcastle. They and the last of the funeral goers had just left the boneyard. As the gravedigger lobbed the last few shovelfuls of earth into the grave, Mike Devine commented, "It's sad." "What is?" "They're all gone home, leaving him here on his own in the cold, wet ground. That's it. He's finished. Useless in the ground." To many, and Old Man would say the younger the better, Fallon's body was a pointless mass in the ground. But the cemetery caretaker would beg to differ. The kamikaze chicken wasn't only worm fodder. Josh's body fed a lot more than worms. His body, along with the rest of the bodies in this cemetery, provided unending beneficial mycorrhizal fungi that help with the decomposition process. He was the caretaker on so many levels, a symbiotic relationship any funeral goer would never understand and wouldn't want to understand. It was all about the fungi, the mold, to be more exact. The mold. You are what you eat. Old Man asked Mike, "Were you acquainted with young Fallon?" "Knew of him," the gravedigger answered. "He liked to play chicken with oncoming traffic." "Chicken? The caretaker stared at the mucky ground, shaking his head in despair at humanity and chickens. Old Man cast a glance up at the weeping willow tree growing from a plot of land next to the cemetery. The majestic tree leaned in far over the burial ground, weeping for the souls of the dearly departed. Crows were up there in the branches, making an all-merciful racket this late afternoon. The treetop cacophony started up around this time of the evening as the birds hustled for branch space and settled daily scores. Old Man often imagined he was one of those crows, perched in the branches at night, watching over the empty cemetery below, observing how the shadows of the weeping branches danced over Jesus on a cross effigies, and the cats prowling amongst the headstones, those guardians of the dead. The cemetery caretaker feared what the night might bring.
"The hardest work in a cemetery isn't carving out a 6-foot hole in the ground," started Old Man.
In a muted voice, Divine muttered, "Especially if you dug it by yourself," with his back to the cemetery caretaker.
"What's that, son?"
He'd heard the gravedigger with crystal clarity, but he was playing a role so long now he'd become that role. All that was about to change. "I was just saying, you're right, and experience alone can only tell you that." Mike didn't break his momentum, shoveling fresh earth onto the speed demon's fancy glossy mahogany casket in the cold ground. Fallon's mausoleum, a work in progress, was a grandiose affair, to the point of being tacky, with aluminium-winged cherubs and rushing chariots. The solar-powered jukebox playing Christy Moore's rendition of Ride On, which is a song about riding a horse, not a 1500cc Kawasaki, on a loop, and night sky lasers would be added later. This sepulchre was as big as the caretaker's moderate dwellings over on the other side of the cemetery. The visible part of his house, that is. Before Mike filled in the grave, the old man signalled young Divine to step aside while he lobbed a couple of symbolic shovelfuls of earth into the grave and said a few complimentary words, as was his custom.
"God bless you, Josh,"
huffed the humpbacked caretaker as he scraped up the last of the fresh earth.
"Even your guardian angel can get it wrong sometimes, son. He turns his back."
Mike interrupted. Or she. Her back.
"For a split second and—"
He clapped his hands, dropping his shovel.
"Lights out, John."
"Josh."
"John,"
the old man continued,
"your guardian angel didn't watch over you in life, but he might check in on you every now and again, now that you're, well, easier to keep an eye on. Amen."
Old Man put his hands in the front pockets of his grubby donkey jacket and played with the eclectic selection of multi-limbed arthropods and lumbricidii. The slimy sensation of the worming, wriggling and crawling in the palms of his hands brought him unending comfort. It was his cup of tea. Mike asked, "What kind of family buries family on Halloween?"
"A superstitious one, boy,"
answered the cemetery caretaker.
"You may think medieval superstition is a thing of the past, but lurking just under the surface—"
Old Man wriggled his gnarled fingers for effect.
"It still exists, and influences bankers, doctors, jailers, bakers, gravediggers, and vagabonds all just the same."
"Maybe," concluded Mike. Old Man tugged the fleshy lobe of his left ear.
"Speak up, son,"
Mike repeated. "I said maybe." The gravedigger didn't sound convinced.
"Go back to your books, lad, and learn about the Celtic origins of Samhain, the sacred fire festivals, and the faces of the demons seen in the lick of the flame."
As the cemetery caretaker spoke, young Divine saw the old man's eyes glow and burn. Old Man knew this because he could see it in the young man's eyes.
"It's not all about silly costumes, pumpkins, and trick-and-treats."
After a pause, Old Man muttered,
"All gods are pagan."
Mike Divine wasn't interested in gods, and if they were pagan. "What's wrong with you today? You're not your lovable old grumpy self."
"Oh, it's Halloween,"
the caretaker answered in ominous tones. Again, his line of vision was carried to the drooping, weeping willow. "Don't tell me you're afraid. You've been working inside these cemetery walls all your life." Nobody knew when Old Man begun working at the burial ground. It seemed as if he'd been there all his life and everyone else's life in Oldcastle. The ancient caretaker gestured to the limestone wall with a sheepish look on his withered face.
"Afraid of what's outside these walls, son, not what's inside them."
The old man's words struck a chord with young Divine. The cemetery caretaker and his assistant lobbed their tools into a squeaky wheelbarrow. Once they had tidied up around the new tomb monstrosity, they made for the shed, which doubled as the workers' office built next to the caretaker's modest home. The wheelbarrow squeaked intermittently in the silence. Old Man bid his young apprentice good evening, warning him to be on time tomorrow morning, as one of the busiest days in the cemetery calendar was upon them, All Souls' Day, November 1st. But the truth of the matter was that Old Man wasn't even sure there would be a tomorrow, for him at least. Leaving through the gates, Mike Divine turned and asked, "Are you going to watch the blood moon eclipse?" The old caretaker turned back and pulled at the fleshy lobe of his right ear. "I said,"
Mike sighed and muttered, "Oh, fuck." He didn't have the energy to repeat what he'd just said. And then he'd have to explain that too. The poor old fool thinks the internet is something to catch fish with, and Amazon is a rainforest far away. Some old farts just don't know when it's time to shuffle their mortal coil. Was that the expression? Mike flashed a forced smile and waved, then turned for home, unaware it was to be the last time he would see Old Man in his present form. If he had taken the time with the old man, it might have surprised him to learn the caretaker knew what a lunar eclipse was, and the implications of a rare blood moon veiling, and what can happen when the stars align and convene. Mike Devine might have learned all about what lay hibernating beneath the soles of his burgundy Dr. Martens, besides cold, mould fodder cadavers. But, as they say, patience is a virtue. Old Man watched his apprentice walk away with a healthy spring in his step, and it saddened him to remember what it was like to be young. Not that he could remember what it was like to be young. "Stay young," muttered Old Man, then tottered down the limestone flagstone pathway to his petite, damp house. As he came to the middle flagstone, the fourth one, and he didn't have to count any more, he stepped off the path and walked along the grass where his treading boots had cut a small track into the ground over the years. The caretaker never forgot to circumvent that flagstone, but even if he did, the colony of felines sitting on that flagstone reminded him to walk around them. He stepped back onto the path and continued up to his front door, then crossed the line nobody had crossed. The drone of buzzing flies filled the little house. Old Man took the putrid-smelling tins of cat food from the fridge, averting his eyes from the glass jar down at the back of the unplugged fridge he used as a drawer. He had got used to looking at it over the past year, but it still resonated with him. He wasn't squeamish about the darkly crimson liquid inside the glass jar. It was what it represented. It was symbolic, and tonight was the night of the blood moon eclipse, and, well, the rest is history. The cemetery caretaker went to feed the growing cat colony concentrated around the winding flagstone pathway. Up to 30 slumbering cats, with one eye always open, were resting on paving slab number 4. "Psh, psh, 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 psh. Get your grub, yummy yums, kitty cats." The cats eyed the ancient caretaker as he shambled towards them. The felines whined and cried out to their master, stretched and licked themselves. Tails of different colours stood on end as the cemetery caretaker forked out the stinky cat food. His feline friends didn't seem to mind the strong whiff coming from the half-rotten, canned meat. In fact, they seemed to prefer it. It suited the caretaker because the stench attracted all manner of flies, which he partook of when the occasion arose. Old Man liked to keep cats around because they watched over the souls of the departed. They were the guardians of the dead when night fell. It was such a sweet symbiosis. The impressive feline colony had begun with one cat, his own cat, Scallywag. So many years ago, Old Man couldn't recall which decade it had been. Never mind which year. Scallywag attracted a tomcat. He let them congregate and copulate. Old Man shooed Scallywag's descendants out of his way and got down on his hands and knees with a huff and a pant. He ran his calloused fingers over the time-worn, engraved letters of his own name on the 4th flagstone. "Danny, how are thee?" Passers-by would have suspected nothing unusual about that path leading to the caretaker's house. But if one of those passers-by dropped a coin, and reaching down to fetch that coin, they just might see the ancient name of Daniel Cronin in Old English, and realize flagstone number 4, slightly out of line with the rest of the flagstones, was in fact a 1600s gravestone. At some moment in history, Old Man's alter ego, his own skeleton in the ground, once named Daniel Cronin, had become a shoulder to cry on. Sometimes immortality got Old Man down, and nobody would understand his plight better than his own former self, as he'd complained enough times to his other half in the ground. The cemetery caretaker had grown quite accustomed to talking to himself. Old Man often thought about having a chat with his former wife, but she was long since deceased, and he couldn't remember where her grave was. Gertie was here somewhere, buried deep below the newer graves that had come to the cemetery through the years. He kind of liked the mystery of not knowing where she was, and found odd comfort in the fact that she was here, somewhere nearby.
Thou art lucky in rest. I'm a-weary. I'm the goldfish following his own tail,
Old Man told his deceased alter ego Daniel.
But it finishes tonight, Danny.
He shuffled to take the weight off his aching knees on the limestone. He studied his gnarled hands supporting his weight. The frame he carried had become so old, the flesh on his hands was no different in tone or hue to the blotchy grey lichen-coated limestone he rested on.
Oh, I'm not able for it any more.
He could discern the voice of his dead half coming up through the soil.
What's that, Danny?
Old Man grew sombre. He didn't like whatever his deceased self had said.
I should have returned to the walls a long time ago, my old heart, but this thing keeps me from resting. That's the oath I and others like me took, and others will come after me and carry on with the cause.
With a baleful gaze, he looked up at the bruising sky. It was dusk by now, and the moon was sliding into view.
The stars are in alignment, and everything in the heavens is pointing in the right direction. God knows I would like to join you, and we can rest as one. But, he shrugged, the mighty celestial bodies were never in any hurry, and always remain above the fray. I won't rest until the experiment has been completed. Then I might join you.
Old Man bid his dead self, Danny to friends and himself, good evening, and got up from the ground with a weary heave. He went inside the house, where he made his way to the kitchen and grabbed a spoon from the cutlery drawer, but opted for a blunt knife instead. He lit the candle in the candle holder and slipped his twisted index finger into the ring. Old Man didn't have electricity. He did not need such luxuries as light and heat. There was a little detail of his bad habit, but he'd keep the log fire to himself. After waiting around for the stars to align, Daniel, a.k.a. Danny, a.k.a. Old Man, felt he deserved a little self-indulgence. He took the glass jar of liquid from the fridge and doddered down the hallway to the opened basement door. Old Man plodded downstairs, taking each step downwards, and downwards. The little house was like an iceberg, most of it being below ground, while the house itself was just a little piece of ice above water. Halfway down the steps, the dampened chorus of croaking, burping frogs filled the dim, dank basement. Old Man smiled into the glow thrown from the candle as he reached the bottom of the stairs.
Ah, my slippery friends, I brought thee something to play with before eating.
The stony-faced amphibians came hopping out of the darkness. The caretaker placed the glass jar on the bottom step and fished out a fistful of wriggling insects from his left coat pocket while holding the candle in his right. He dumped the choice selection of arthropods and annelids onto the damp earthen ground in one wriggling pile. The caretaker then switched hands and grabbed a fistful of legged creepy crawlies from his right pocket and stuffed the wiggling ball into his mouth and swallowed without chewing. The frogs gathered at the old man's boots. He studied each one, looking over their backs. He nodded with an approving smile. They glistened in the candlelight. The conditions were just right down here. The cold-blooded amphibians were Old Man's canary in a gold mine. Having fed his trusty amphibians, he made a hard right in around the back of the stairs, where he was met by a dead end, and God knows it was anything but dead. Black mould had formed in thick, conspicuous patches up and down the walls, but here it thrived in the cool, clammy atmosphere. While the frogs flashed their sticky tongues at the skittering pile of goodies, the old man drew his blunt knife to the wall and scraped the black mould, collecting it in the glass jar. Once he had enough fungi collected, the caretaker set the jar on the ground and stirred the black mould and liquid. Within seconds, he had worked up a dark burgundy paste. With the same dull knife, he scratched out the concoction and applied it to a specific area of the wall suffocated by black mould. So thick it oozed in pustules. He started up with a chant, low and guttural, as he daubed the bloody mould cocktail to the house's foundations. The candle sputtered as the unblinking frogs stalked the remaining insects. caterpillars and worms that wriggled, darted, and burrowed from the shadows. As Old Man spoke in strange tongues, the basement became filled with the muffled sounds of scampering flesh, brushing bodies, and the pad of frantic feet. Shadows danced across the mouldy walls. The glassy-eyed amphibians skipped between the flurry of misshapen feet while they grunted and croaked. But it was the sudden shrieking bawl in the basement that startled Old Man. So much so he almost felt he was alive again as his stone-cold heart skipped a beat. For such a tiny thing, it made an unmerciful din, and put the languid fear of God into him. The fear was only his imagination. Of course it was. Still, it was nice to feel what it was like to be scared.